welcome to the Legislative Report with your State Representative Warren Kampf. I'm Laurie Bull, your host. And welcome today, and we're going to be talking about some very serious topics today. Representative, welcome to the program.
Hi, Laurie. Glad to be here.
And you had wanted to discuss today school safety measures in light of recent school shootings. Really, they go back years now, and there's too many to name, unfortunately. That's the sad part of it. But it is in the headlines, and it's something that you felt was important to look at, how Pennsylvania views these, how our schools are handling preventative measures and things like that. Can you talk about some legislation that you're putting forward?
Right. Laurie, so I rolled out kind of a blueprint for what I think the state government should do to address this problem of mass shootings. I don't think that it's any one solution. I think it's leveled.
Sure.
And so here it is. I do think that common sense gun control is a piece of it. And I think most of my constituents agree with that. That may not solve the whole problem, but I think it's something. In my legislative career, I've generally supported, and so here goes with those. There's a bill that's been around for a while which would close a loophole in Pennsylvania. Right now, under our state law, if I own a long gun, shotgun, an AR-15, I can sell it or give it to somebody, a neighbor, a friend, a stranger, and that person doesn't have to go through a background check. Any other kind of sale, a handgun or in a store or whatnot, a non-private sale, you do have to get a background check. And background checks can be useful. I've seen some statistics that show that they do prevent significant numbers of purchases by people who are not lawfully allowed to have firearms in Pennsylvania. So I think we need to vote on that bill. I've been a co-sponsor of it, and I think we should do that. I just introduced House Bill 2216 about a week ago, and that would ban high-capacity magazines. This is a magazine that can be loaded into a firearm of anything greater than 10 bullets. And the thinking there is if that saves one life because a person has to, is intent on doing terrible things, has to reload, as it were, because of that ban, and they're tackled or killed by a law enforcement person in the interim, then it was worth doing. And a lot of these, assault rifles or semi-automatic weapons, when they're utilized in this kind of a terrible, terrible situation, they've had these big magazines. So, and the bill also, 2216, also bans conversion devices. What that means to a lay person is, think about the shooting in Nevada. The perpetrator was using something called a bump stock, which I guess uses the kick of the gun to accelerate the amount of fire that comes out of the gun, kind of turning it into a machine gun. So the bill 2216 would ban that. Neither of those things to me are something that a regular citizen needs to possess, and it doesn't prevent somebody who's a recreational hunter or something like that, or wants to have self-defense from owning a firearm. In addition to that, a number of laws around the country have been enacted called red flag legislation. And this is essentially saying if a person has shown signs that they're in the possession of a firearm, they've shown signs that they might be prone to violent behavior, and they're in the possession of a firearm, that a family member or a police officer could get a court to issue kind of a seizure of the firearm. Now, the bill would have, and the laws around the country that already exist in this vein, have a pretty high standard. a number of things that the court would have to consider before issuing such a seizure order. And the individual, the firearm owner, under constitutional law, would have the right to a hearing pretty quickly after the firearms were seized by the police. But it seems to me in a number of these situations around the country where these mass killings have occurred, we often hear that there were some behaviors, interactions with law enforcement that probably would have yielded the seizure of the firearms, at least to get that person down a road to stability, and that it didn't happen because in many of these states those laws don't currently exist. So this red flag legislation, I'm co-prime sponsor with Todd Stevens, my colleague from Montgomery County, on. And then there's another bill. It's a little off topic from some of the recent mass shootings, but under Pennsylvania law, again, kind of a gap in our law. If somebody has a protection from abuse order against another person, say their spouse, their estranged spouse, and the spouse owns firearms, you would think that in the issuance of that order there would also be a seizure of the firearms. But under current law, while it may happen, courts may actually do that as part of issuing the order, they're not required to do that, I don't think, until a maximum of 60 days after the issuance of the order, which doesn't seem to me to be terribly sensible. So there are two bills, one in the House, one in there's a Senate bill which passed the Senate, it is now in the House, and then the House has its own bill to close that down to, I think, 24 hours to seize the firearms. So those are the sort of the package of bills related to what I would call gun safety or gun control. In addition to that, I've got a couple of other concepts maybe we can talk about for school safety.
Sure, and before we move on to that, I guess there's some proponents of Second Amendment rights that would say if you begin to ban certain weapons, then that becomes a slippery slope. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I mean, I believe that the courts, I'm a lawyer, I do follow this somewhat closely. I believe the courts have long held that guns can be regulated. I mean, we have a long-standing ban on automatic weapons. Think of a machine gun, and some other true weapons of war. You're permitted to have licensure. There are some places that you're not permitted to carry. And so I don't think the courts would look at this. We had an assault weapons ban at the national level for years. So I don't think that the courts would say for the legislation that I've talked about, high capacity magazines, conversion devices, a temporary seizure of firearms from a person who's displaying really erratic and violent behavior, that the courts would say that that violates the Second Amendment. And so that's what I would say to those individuals. And the flip side is we're dealing with a trend in our society which is it's almost unspeakable how awful it is that individuals, neighbors, people we don't see come out of the shadows and do these terrible things. And it's almost always with firearms. So is there a way to balance what are constitutional rights with the safety of our children? I have a 9-year-old daughter in an elementary school, and the day after Parkland happened, I was in there just happenstance, and I just stopped in my tracks thinking about that going on. And if I can be a part of something that reduces the loss of life or prevents that from happening in the future, then I want to be, and I think my constituents want me to be.
And you wanted to turn to the school aspect of it. I have children in school as well, and they have to do these safety drills, and it's a scary reality for our kids nowadays that they have to practice barricading themselves in a room, or if they're in the bathroom standing on a toilet or something like that, with the thought of of some person coming in wanting to take as many lives as possible. But it is reality, unfortunately, in today's world. So in addressing the school aspect of it and the preparedness for schools, what are your thoughts on that?
So I did talk to a couple of school superintendents on this subject, and the thing I got was, there are security measures that they could do in addition to what they're already doing in our area. But they don't want the state to tell them exactly what needs to be done. A bill that would require everybody to have a metal detector, or everybody to have an armed security guard, or something like that. They don't want those mandates. They would like to have some more resources if they locally identify something that they could do in sort of consultation with the local police department. And we do have a Safe Schools line item in the state budget, and I've proposed bumping or increasing the size of that appropriation, millions more dollars, so that local districts could apply for larger grants in order to do something to enhance school security. Another thing that I've kind of talked about and as part of this package is a deep dive on our mental health system and delivery system for our young people. Because in talking to some superintendents and school administrators, at least the question was raised whether there is sufficient space for a person. Let's say some youngster is identified as being a risk to cause harm to themselves or to another. Are there sufficient resources or spaces in an alternative environment for a period of time? And some of the school administrators suggested that in their experience, there's not always the space or the appropriate resources to to try to address that particular child's problem. And so I introduced a resolution which, if voted on by the entire House, doesn't need to go to the Senate, would require the Joint State Government Commission, which has been in existence for a long time, to do a study and a deep dive of our young person's mental health delivery system. Are there gaps in it? Are there things that we might do? So that's another component, in addition to kind of reasonable gun legislation, some more dollars for school safety, and then a deep dive on the mental health system as it currently exists for our young people. And I think if we do all three of those things, in the general categories, I think we can face our constituents and say, we're doing something to try to eliminate this fear that people legitimately have today.
So where is that legislation in the process at this point?
So the resolution on the mental health study for young people is in the House Health Committee. It was just introduced a couple of weeks ago. I've asked the chairman to run that bill out of committee, and then it will come to the House floor, hopefully for a vote. The House bill on magazines and conversion devices is in the Judiciary Committee. I was actually in front of the Judiciary Committee talking about it last week. The Judiciary Committee of the House, I thought, did something very good. They invited many different members who had bills on school safety and gun legislation to come in and make their pitch and their requests that the committee move some of these bills. And I think Chairman Marsico, Ron Marsico, will move some of these bills. Precisely which ones, I don't know. But my bill on the 2216 will hopefully be on that list. I think the red flag legislation has a shot of coming out of the Judiciary Committee, and a couple of others. And then with the school funding piece, I've written and spoken to the appropriations chairman. I serve on the budget committee in the House, trying to get some increased dollars in that line item for school safety grants.
That sounds like a good work, and much work to be done yet. But it seems like a good time now to take a break before we move on to another topic. So when we return, we'll be talking about the opioid crisis in Pennsylvania, and we'll speak with Representative Kampf on his ideas on that. We'll be back in just a minute.
Did you know that Act 16 of 1999 honors one of the greatest leaders in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives? The Matthew J. Ryan Legislative Office Building, once known as the Capitol Annex, is located next to the main Capitol building and honors the late Speaker of the House, Matthew J. Ryan. Those who visit this building will observe the magnificent architectural designs providing eloquence and grandeur to the building. Known as one of the greatest members in the history of the Pennsylvania State House, Matthew Ryan started his career in the legislature in 1963 and was elected Speaker in 1981. His charisma and knowledge will forever be reflected in the building now named after this great legislative leader. Now you know.
Did you know that in the corridors in the first floor of the Capitol of Pennsylvania, there are nearly 400 individual mosaics? The idea for creating these intricate tiles was first suggested by Henry C. Mercer in 1902. A year later, he received the commission to prove 16,000 square feet of pavement tiles for the Great Rotunda and corridors of the new State Capitol building in Harrisburg. Mercer set about designing subjects for approximately 400 mosaics. He chose as his general theme the history of Pennsylvania, and he soon realized that his tiles could tell stories. Although the arrangement seems random, the mosaics are very thoughtfully placed in the floor. The tile sequence is roughly chronological, beginning at one end with the scenes depicting the Native Americans. The mosaics progress into the story of European habitation in the New World and encompass the Commonwealth's triumph through process and intervention. Now you know.
Welcome back to Legislative Report with your state representative, Warren Kampf. Today we're discussing several topics, and right now we're going to move on and discuss the opioid crisis in Pennsylvania. Representative Kampf, welcome back.
Okay, all right, Lori.
And the governor has declared this a state of emergency regarding the opioid crisis. I believe President Trump has also declared some type of state of emergency for our country. It is nationwide, and it is all across Pennsylvania, rural, urban, suburban, it's everywhere.
Yes.
What has the House done to this point?
So, the House and the Senate and the administration, I think we've done some good work. I want to make it clear, though, the number of deaths continue to go up from this, and we definitely have more work that we need to do. A piece of this kind of opioid heroin epidemic is overprescribing, in my opinion. And so we have passed some legislation on that that's been enacted into law, signed by the governor. For example, it's now required that if somebody's coming out of the emergency department, the emergency physician is only permitted, except in very limited exceptions, to give a prescription for 7 days of an opioid, as opposed to 20, 30, 60, or whatever they might have been accustomed to doing. And then with respect to minors, it's no more than 7 days under any circumstances, whether you're coming out of the emergency department or you're at your orthopedic doctor. So I think those are good limits. In addition to that, we passed what's called the PDMP, and it's the Physician Drug Monitoring Program. And these are in existence around the country. And essentially it's that every physician who's prescribing has to register the prescription, and the pharmacy has to check it. The main purpose, as I think of it, is to stop doctor shopping, right? So you go to one doctor, you say you're in pain, you get a prescription, and then a couple of days later you go to another one, you get another prescription, and so on and so forth. It also, I think, helps to identify pill mills, right? This is a place where, a doctor maybe, for whatever reason, is prescribing just for the sake of prescribing, and to stamp out that problem, which does lead to, in the end, addiction, and so that PDMP has only been in place for a couple of years. We have seen a decline in the number of prescriptions as a result of it. I want to say maybe 15 or 20%, so that's a good thing. So I do think that those laws in particular are having an impact. But we do, there are consequences to this, right? The typical path, as I understand it, is somebody gets hooked on prescription drugs, and then when they can't access that anymore, they move into heroin. And heroin is, terribly inexpensive and terribly deadly today. There's some agent that's put in it, I guess it's called fentanyl or carfentanil. I've read news stories. A lot of this stuff is getting imported from China, perhaps some other places around the world. I think the federal government maybe just listed it as a sort of a criminal or a much more controlled substance. So hopefully we'll see greater investigations and prosecutions by our U.S. attorneys and the federal system to try to stamp out the supply of this stuff. But it's totally deadly. So you're hooked on prescription drugs, you can't get them, you move into heroin, and then you take this stuff, I guess you get some kind of unprecedented high, but then you die. And adding to that, so another thing we've done is we've made Narcan, which is sort of the saver drug, much more available for police, for EMTs, even family members. But a phenomenon we're now seeing is, somebody goes into overdose and is the police are called, and Narcan is administered because they're effectively dead. They're revived, and then 5 hours later, or the next day, same thing happens to the same person, right? So you're having a couple of saves with Narcan on the same person in a 24, 48-hour period. So, so this is kind of a moving target, and while it's great to have Narcan, and there have been a lot of saves, I want to say, thousands of saves since we've implemented this kind of delivery system for Narcan. We're still seeing more and more deaths. So,
would you say the next step is trying to figure out how to get those folks into treatment and having enough treatment centers that are affordable?
Well, this is so. So I had parents come to see me about a situation, and from that, and then of course from other sources as well, what I've come to understand is, you get a young person who needs to go into recovery. They go for a little while, or they resist going, and so it becomes kind of a revolving door, and we want to make it so that it's not a revolving door. But the question is, with personal freedoms and whatnot, how do you do that? I do think there are a lot of resources out there for somebody who is willing to accept treatment. All right, we've added hundreds of millions of dollars to the state budget, not only for treatment centers but for our existing county drug and alcohol system. We have a separate bureau in the state government that's dealing with drug and alcohol abuse, and that's got robust funding. But in the end, the issue for us is, how do we get someone who's hooked, maybe not thinking straight, to say, okay, I'm going to be committed to this. And this process takes a long time. Sure. I mean, I've heard a year, 2 years. There's a recovery house in my district that a guy started because his son was in in this kind of a situation. And he says it's 2 years, he thinks, right? You know, maybe you go detox for a couple of days, you go 30 days or a little longer in a true rehab inpatient facility. Then you transition to a halfway house where you're with some guys or gals who are in the same situation, very controlled environment. You know, you're going out, maybe you're working, you're going to NA or AA or some treatment and counseling. But then even after that, you still want to be in a structured environment and around folks who, you know, who are on your side or going through the same thing. Well, to get somebody to agree to do all that is no easy matter. And the parents who came in to see me, their solution is, and I've been, you know, looking at the legislation that we might be able to do, their solution is really kind of have a hammer. Person gets, you know, gets in one of these situations where they're caught getting high or they've overdosed. They're charged. And then if they don't go into rehab and stay in, that the court can, you know, send them to jail. You know, there are lots of issues with that sort of proposal, but parents are desperate,
Are asking for that, yeah.
right? Because they know what the end is, what the outcome is. Were I a parent under those circumstances, I'm sure I'd be willing to try anything.
Yeah. I guess education is an important part of it, just making sure as much information gets out to people as possible. One kind of smaller aspect of that is the disposal of these opioids. Say you've had a surgery and they prescribed 40 pills for you and you use 20, and you've got 20 sitting in your medicine cabinet and you've got a teenager in your house or something like that. I imagine there's probably places in your district, a lot of times police departments will offer a place for people to bring in their unused prescription drugs to get them out of the hands of anyone that might want to misuse them.
Right. These take-back boxes, and I think it's getting into the kind of the consciousness of our citizens that they don't want to keep these things around.
Or flush them either.
Yeah, right, and that's right, and don't.
Not-
so
and
don't
not to
flush
do that
them,
as
right?
well.
It's against totally not a good idea. But my police departments have them. I know that there are upwards of 20, maybe more, take-back boxes in Chester County, which is one of the counties I serve. So yeah, so that is an important part of it, and education is critical. I'm sure Montgomery County has this. I know Chester County has it, a task force that's working on making sure that we have a good healthcare team that's able to kind of do a bit of a wraparound for somebody who comes into the healthcare system in this situation, and also pushing for awareness, education, and take-back boxes wherever.
Well, I thank you so much for your efforts, and I know you're going to continue to work with the community and do whatever can be done. Even if it's a small thing, it's better than just sitting back, because that's certainly not going to help. But thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks.
And that's all the time we have for today's program. If you have any questions for Representative Kampf or need assistance with a state matter, please feel free to contact him at one of his local offices or his Harrisburg office as well. And all that contact information will be shown in just a moment. Thanks for watching, and join us again next time for Legislative Report.